Welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Join me in welcoming environmental lawyer, mentor, columnist, Inder Comar, who's on the front lines exploring the possibility of creating much-needed change in partnership with the corporations that he often faces off with in court. Inder Comar. Well, I'm not even going to chat with you anymore. I'm going to just go straight into an intro because I want to hear how you're doing. I want to catch up with you. Sure. Inder Comar, thank you so much for coming on to the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And it's been a while. The way I've been keeping up with you, Inder, is I've been, it's months ago now that I noticed your name as an option to click on in my news aggregator. As a regular columnist. And so I've been doing that embarrassingly infrequently because of my reading load, but it's great to at least catch up with you that way.
Yeah.
And, more than a year ago, we had a couple of interviews here on the podcast. And, the way I know you is I vaguely know of your at least then bi-coastal practice in law and with a particularly environmental focus, and with your ability to put together words, whether it's standing up and giving a talk of some kind, or obviously in your writing as well. And I also know that you back when we were talking, you had some other kind of a growing organization that you of one kind or another. Yeah. So instead of me stumbling through what I recall and what I'm excited to hear about, I just want to welcome you back. And if you wouldn't mind, catch us up. What have you been up to?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dean. First of all, thanks for having me back. It's great to catch up with you. So I think we did first speak about in October of last year, and I think as I recall, I'd just given a talk at Lafayette College.
Yeah, exactly.
Transcript about climate change and the need for pretty urgent, immediate action with respect to and not just personal action, but I mean like social action, government action, since that time, I set up a nonprofit called Just Atonement. And it's a legal nonprofit. The idea being that we will be bringing cases and doing litigation and advocacy work. And for the last 6 months or so, or 8 months, really, we've been researching, what's a good strategy that hasn't been tried yet that we think might work in terms of the challenge of climate change. And by the challenge, I think you and I both appreciate the challenge, and maybe we both might very well still be in some denial about the reality of what's coming up, but the challenge as I see it is existential, and I heard a great phrase a few months ago, the challenge of having the problems not being yet on the horizon, like the problems that we create today, they're going to become obvious 15, 20, 50 years from now. The time to act is today, right? But because we can't see the horizon, we can't see the consequences on the horizon, something in our brains, or we're not trained, we're not educated in that way to think like that, we just, we forget about it and go about our daily lives. Yeah. And the problem is that we make it worse, right? We're making the whole thing just so much worse every single day.
Before you say more about this fledgling organization, would you say the name of it again?
Sure, Just Atonement. So it's justatonement.org, and and that Just Atonement Inc. So we're a fully fledged nonprofit. We were fiscally sponsored for a year by a great organization called the Netroots Foundation. And they fiscally sponsored us until very recently when we got our own 501c3 status. So I'm a big believer in kind of using the corporate form, as I'll get to, I'm a big believer in using the corporate form to create positive impact. And what we've been able to do with my for-profit law firm is create this affiliated nonprofit, kind of, and now we can power this nonprofit in a very kind of new way, independently. We're not tied to any donors, and hopefully that gives us a lot more independence and freedom to do things that we think are important.
Well, what a nice position to be in. That sounds smart, and like it frees up an awful lot of energy that other organizations who aren't quite so well funded and founded struggle with.
Correct. Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, the big problem, I think, in the nonprofit space is independence, right? So because you're tied typically to donors, you're tied typically to funders, and if you're doing something that's not aligned with exactly what the grant lets you do, you can't do it. So or nonprofit legal organizations, some of them are very lucky and they generate legal fees for themselves, but that takes time. That takes years and years. And one thing that's become obvious to me as I do more climate work is we don't have years and years, right? So it's more about how do we make the biggest impact with the resources we have today, and to create a conversation. And yeah.
So tell us what does this organization do? Where are you headed?
Yeah. So currently, what Just Atonement is doing, that the last year or so, we've had the most actual success with internship programs, which really surprised me. But there was a huge kind of clamoring, and from law students in particular, to work in human rights. And there really, I guess, aren't a lot of human rights organizations out there anymore, or the ones that are there don't have a lot of opportunities. And now I did a first summer program this past summer with 8 students, which was really fantastic and led to a lot of the current initiatives that we're working on. We have a fall kind of cohort. We'll have a cohort starting in January, from January through March, and then we'll do another summer program. And it's really amazing because this past summer, for example, these were exceptionally bright law students coming from all over the world to New York City to learn about climate change, to learn about the international law of war and peace. So those are the 2 topics we discussed. And it was just amazing to see how much they learned. And what I think, to me, I guess because I'm in it, you take for granted in terms of your basic knowledge, but to them was really eye-opening in terms of where things are, in terms of what the status of the law is. One of the biggest, I think, surprises to them was, when we talked about the Paris Agreement, what they learned, because that's what everyone learns, is that, hey, all the diplomats of the world got together and we fixed it. So we're done. What's the big deal? And, we had to really look at that and say, well, actually, even if we were to abide by 2 degrees, which we're not going to do, but even if, that's a disaster, right? So it's, unfortunately, it's not that simple. And I think a lot of them were very surprised in their worldviews. And it was surprising to me as well to relearn this stuff too, but just how the biggest challenge I see for us as a species is just the complete dereliction of duty by our current leaders, and it was, I think, a surprise to them to just see how much everyone kind of screwed the pooch, so to speak, with just saying, well, we'll just do 2 degrees and then we'll call it a day. And, it's like, well, I mean, that's one approach. I think that's a terrible approach, but that's kind of that's kind of the compromise that these countries made for whatever reason. And there's a growing frustration, understandable frustration, that it's not appropriate anymore.
Yeah. Inder, when you started to describe just now what just what does this nonprofit do, you brought up the word human rights.
Yes.
And you also mentioned somewhere in there the idea of war and peace somehow fitting into this conversation.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, it's intersectional of many other topics. But can you start with the human rights? Like, what do you mean when you're including that in the nature of the work of this nonprofit?
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question. We are at the intersection of three legal topics: war and peace, climate change, and human rights. So we are at that kind of that intersection. And the reason for that is because I think that I think that the solution, as I see it, lies in that intersection, which is at heart a robust defense of our human rights, and there is a lot of exploration now amongst legal scholars, um, going back to first principles, brass tacks, human rights, like the right to life, right? You and I have a right to live on this planet, full stop, right? And when we look at the conflicts that never get settled, or when we look at the way the world is going to look in 50 years, that's a direct threat to our ability to live. And there's a growing, I think, scholastic movement, I would say, and I think it is a movement, amongst very, hardened, expert international legal scholars that, the right to life is more in peril today than it has been ever, for these existential reasons.
Right.
Yeah. So I think when I use that phrase human rights, I think we are trying to reimagine what that means in a world where climate is changing radically, where conflict is coming out of that as a result.
Right. So I guess I have a little bit of an agenda in my first question, and I appreciate what you've just said. It's very clear, and I appreciate it. And you have my standing ovation for that intersection, by the way, by the topics that you've chosen to weave. I've had I'm writing my second book, which includes a workbook for people this time around, and how to put this question. So you're talking about human rights, and it seems like they are as at risk as they've ever been in these times. And what I keep bumping into when I explore that thread is that what we appear to be confronting is that there are something other than human rights that are in direct competition and clearly have more power in the conversation, no matter what the conversation is. It seems like this other entity has more power going head to head with the notion of inherent human rights. And, to just show my hand fully, it seems to be that what we're talking about is superhuman rights, which are owned and fully integrated into the body of the corporatist business as usual structures.
Sure.
Is that safe to say? And is that somewhere in the vicinity of where the tension is in your work?
That's a fascinating way to put it. And yes. So I think what we're dealing with, I think the answer is yes. I think what we're dealing with and what you've identified for me, and the way I would phrase it, but I think it's kind of co-equivalent, is we're dealing with the legacies of imperialism, which exists today, of dominance of some people over others, and exploitation, economic exploitation, combined. So those things create tiers, yes. And so I would say that in our society today, I would agree with you. There are people with superhuman rights, right? Or who not only are entitled to and receive basic human rights, but they receive some type of status rights. They They receive some additional privileges that other people don't get. And that is exactly what we're dealing with. And I think some of the resistance to dealing with climate change, certainly by the powerful countries, is a precise understanding of that, which is that if we give any country, Malaysia, Indonesia, whatever, little tiny Kiribati, if we give them any type of technology transfer or economic incentives, or we change our ways, that power dynamic goes away. There is superhuman rights stop being so super. And that is something psychologically that people are resistant to with those rights. And people with privilege don't want to give up their privilege, right? And even if it means creating a better world for everybody, including themselves, right? Or even if it means avoiding a terrible outcome for everybody, including themselves. Like, what good is it to be a privileged person when you've created a terrible environmental situation to live in, right? But somehow that's where we're at. I think you hit the nail right on the head, actually. I mean, I think that is the major impediment to, and it varies by country. I mean, there's obviously cultural concerns or whatever. I mean, one of the things we did this summer is look at Kiribati. We looked at this small island country that's sinking, or not sinking, but the way the oceans are rising above it, right? And one of the things we discovered is that climate denialism doesn't go away, right? Even when the waters are rising, and Kiribati is religious. Actually, people look to religious explanations,
Mm-hmm.
And that was shocking to me. That even for people who are in it right now, there is something in them doesn't want to deal with it, and I think we're going to see that writ large. And I think we and then with people who do have, or corporate entities that are run by people, that have those superhuman rights, there's a denial, some form of denial about it. And I think that's right. I like the way you put that.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to just kind of riff on it a little bit, share with you a little bit about, again, what's coming up in my next book. And
yeah,
I'd love to get your feedback, because you really are in kind of on the front lines of defining what are human rights for human beings, no kidding, flesh and blood people.
Yeah.
And then what are the analogs in the corporate dimension, in the governmental dimension, in the those who have power dimension. And basically what it starts with is my assertion that there's an awful lot of talk in those who write about climate change and the challenges we've got and so on, about how important our core narrative is, the stories we tell ourselves and culturally.
Yes.
And fair enough. I'm not so sold on that, but I hear it, and I'm certainly willing to play along and listen to whenever somebody has a strong case for that. And I started to look at, I need to address that. It's brought up enough that I'd like to address that in this book. And what I'm asserting is that no matter what country we may have come from originally, what culture we may have come from, and so on, what family stories we might be bringing along from childhood and so on, that I'm asserting that we have adopted collectively, in the USA in particular, we've adopted the corporate charter as our core defining narrative, and all that implies. And so there's a whole lot more to that, and I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole right now, but I'd like to just start by letting you know that's what's at the foundation of what I'm about to say.
Okay.
So the superhuman rights thing is basically, if you look at a corporation, the first one that comes to mind of in terms of these superhuman powers is that it's immortal.
Yeah, right.
If we go with Mitt Romney's assertion that corporations are people,
right.
Well, that's pretty cool, to be a person that doesn't die.
Yeah,
I like it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we could spend all day talking about the legal advantages of impunity, distance from liability, and
Yes.
on and on and on. But just a few of the ones that just seem, for a layperson like myself, they just seem very obvious,
Sure.
are that we're talking about unlimited amounts of money, especially
Okay.
when compared to anyone in the flesh and blood human realm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they have virtually now complete control of government.
Yeah.
And
Or a lot of
when
it.
we compare it to, go ahead.
No, I would say, yeah, at minimum, they have extraordinary influence. At the
Yeah,
maximum level, I think you could reasonably, you could argue that it's effectively a takeover. Sure.
yeah. And so, when I compare that to, no, time after time, it's been asserted through some pretty well done studies that we just have no representation at the pedestrian level. We
Mhm.
just don't.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Um, they have virtually, they have a tremendous amount of influence on education, the form and content of education at every level, and the funding. And
Yes.
then lastly, and perhaps even most importantly, is they have virtually, uh, they have a very tight grip on media
Yes.
and
Oh,
control of the message. And
yes.
so um, I should stop there. I just wanted to run those things by you in terms of just this distinction called superhuman powers at the corporatist level
Yeah.
versus the flesh and blood level. And I guess what I'd finish up with is just, here's my fantasy. Again, I'm a layman, and I
Yeah.
know I got a real weak suit of having a naive part of me, and I will go to my deathbed with that naive part. I just know I will. But I have a fantasy that there is some way in this transformation that we are all forced through right now. This is going to be a tough one. We're going through this, whether we like it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we're in denial or not.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, while things are going through that stage, like the butterfly that goes into the chrysalis and goes into that liquefied liminal state,
Yeah.
if while we're doing that, if we could shift fundamentally the corporate charter
Mhm.
to include an ethical component, a moral component.
Yes.
It's obvious, here's the naive part. I can almost hear you saying, oh God.
No, I get
But,
it.
because as soon as we throw in ethics and morals and the market, it's just heads explode. But
Sure. Yeah.
here's my naive part. I don't see how to do it, how to have many of the changes that seem obvious that we need to have without some fundamental shift of that structure, because it's not hidden anymore. It's obvious that corporations have been spending millions to control the message, that we basically, if we continue down that track, we will absolutely kill ourselves.
Yeah.
So the
So
stakes are incredibly high. So even though this is a naive point I'm making, I'm hoping that there's something worth talking about with you and me, who would know far more about, the realities.
yeah, no,
Of this
I don't think it's
conversation.
naive at all. First of all, I think I'm 100% aligned with you on that. I think the problem we face today is that we have created these, and I mean humans, or especially in the U.S. have we have created these legal fictions, right? These, like, these stories. I mean, a corporation at the end of the day exists just on paper, right? But we treat them like they're real people, like they're real entities,
Mhm.
and we've literally created these other giant, whether they're, like the Titans, the new Titans, and they wander the earth, or the way I tell people when I talk about it now, I actually use the analogy of dragons in the countryside, right? So we've created these dragons that are just, burning up all the sheep, like eating everything, like they're just going nuts. And for better, I mean, not for better or worse, I mean, that's the reality, is that these things, especially um, the energy companies, which are primarily responsible for, especially in the last 20 years, for carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, these things are destroying the planet, full stop. And whether, whether that was intentional or whether that, I think wherever you stand politically or whatever your economic, background is or whatever your philosophy is, I think it's really important to acknowledge that reality, which is that I don't care if you're Marxist or Ayn Randian or whatever it is. The fact of the matter is we are living in a growing environmental catastrophe, and the chief reason for that is through corporate conduct, and we in the US in particular, we haven't forced companies to pay the price, the environmental price or the economic price for their environmental destruction. We let them pollute, and the society pays the price for that, right? In economics, you call this an externality, right? An externality is something that a company or a business doesn't have to pay for, right? But it causes a negative impact on somebody else. So if you were to internalize those externalities, the price of the product would skyrocket, right? If your iPhone was made by someone in the US making $15 an hour, it wouldn't cost $1,000. It would cost triple, quadruple, right? If oil had to pay for the carbon costs that it's putting on everybody, it wouldn't be as cheap as it is. So yeah, I mean, we have let these entities run amok, and I agree that not the only, but a major part of the solution, and I still want to focus on solutions because I think that's the naive part of me. So you talked about the naive part of you. The naive part of me still thinks there's time to make meaningful mitigation, right? And I honestly don't know if that's true or not. I mean, and the more you get into the science, the more daunting it becomes, right? But there is a naive part of me that thinks that we can do something in the next 5 to 10 years to meaningfully mitigate the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, potentially sequester it. And I think the primary way to do that is to tame those dragons. We have to go like dragon hunters, and we have to tame them, and we have to correct their ways so that they cease burning the countryside, and if possible, become allies, right? And let me tell you my fantasy. My fantasy is we go to Chevron or we go to an oil company, and their infrastructure, because their infrastructure dwarfs that of many countries, becomes used meaningfully to help sequester carbon, to help transition our economies to sustainable practices. I mean, that's my fantasy, is that corporations, that we go to the corporations that are the ones causing the most damage, and we tell them it's time to change, because we want to live in a livable planet in 100 years, and that doesn't include the conduct that you're doing. So that's where I'm coming from. But I think we're totally aligned on the point that, corporate conduct absolutely has to change for us to have any meaningful chance of a livable existence with dignity on this planet in 100 years or 50 years.
Yeah. Well, I sure appreciate you kind of going down that particular rabbit hole with me. And what I would like to do is just revisit for a second where we started. And I wanted to be sure that if I had interrupted you, that you'd get a chance to really flesh out the nonprofit, and to whatever degree you'd want to talk about your for-profit practice and what sort of issues you're addressing and what you're seeing out there on the horizon, what catches your eye, what concerns you most as you're looking out in our world right now. So I again appreciate you kind of visiting there for a minute with me into the naive world for both of us. Yeah. But I'd love for you to just take a moment to look again and make sure you've said everything you'd like to say, because I'm excited about the nonprofit you've got going on, and I'm excited also about your perspective as a blogger, journalist, and also in the work that you do. What are you seeing? What are you concerned about? Yeah. And what are your organizations doing? How are they active in all that?
Yeah, so those are great questions. Thanks for that. I would say, the thing that concerns me the most is that there is still a resistance and a denial to, I think, the urgency of the current moment. And, I think that's what frightens me the most, is that even when you talk to people and people, even when you speak with aligned people who acknowledge the gravity of the situation, I think there's still an inability for us to imagine, anything other than business as usual. I think there's a real resistance with colleagues, domestic, international, about the gravity of the situation. I think the 2 degrees of Paris is like a perfect type of, I think for me, a good summary that even when you get, supposedly the best minds in the room to figure this out, and which we do, and, it's not as easy that, because there's all sorts of compromises that have to get made. Everyone's got to put the right language to appease so-and-so or whatever it is. But, the best you can come up with is we're going to stay below 2 degrees, and, well below 2 degrees is the standard, and the target is 1.5. And I think the point is that even if that's the best you can do, that's not good enough. It's totally not good enough. And we're at 1 degree already of warming above pre-industrial levels, and it's not good, right? We have islands, Puerto Rico was destroyed, right, last year. You have islands that are sinking. You look at or not sinking, but being enveloped, I should say. That's kind of the better analogy. I mean, you look at the geologic record where people are going back in time to see what it looked like at 1 degree or 2 degrees, and it's not good, right? So the world was a very different place, completely different. So I think that to me is the biggest challenge, is emphasizing to people, or getting people to the gravity of the situation, is that we are going to live on a totally different planet in 50 years. Totally different. It's not going to be the Earth that you and I knew growing up. It's going to be like we got into a spaceship and got dumped onto a totally different planet. I mean, I think that's not hyperbole to say, in terms of the ecosystems, and in terms of what we're dealing with, in terms of the people movements, right? So there is a whole lot of things that are coming that we're resistant to, and I include myself in that. I totally include myself in that there is a denial. So that's the challenge that I see, and part of why I thought it was important, and I like, the for-profit is my corporate law firm. We do a lot of business finance, work with technology companies. The nonprofit is aligned with that, right, to do the human rights work, the climate work, the war and peace work. It kind of evolved naturally, but I guess what I would say is I view it now as a strength, which is I can talk about these topics. I want to be able to talk about these topics to people who are running those companies, those Fortune 500 companies. And I can say, look, I do this for a living, right? I work with companies for a living. I know what it's like. I have my own company, right? Like, I know what it's like to do this. So when I'm telling you this is an urgent problem, I'm telling you it's an urgent problem because I've looked at this issue, right? And I think I'm hoping it becomes a strength to kind of go to those people and not treat them as an enemy, but to treat them as a potential ally, and to say, look, this is like, you want a livable future for your kids and your grandkids. We all do, right? This is the time. This today is the day we make those changes, because if we wait any longer, we're making the situation just dramatically worse. Every day we wait, every year we wait, it just becomes tougher. It's more carbon we got to pull out of the atmosphere, more changes we have to make to our day-to-day lives. So I would say that that's kind of what brought me here to this moment. But I feel lucky to have the nonprofit. I know there are a lot of lawyers, and I love talking to other lawyers, and I think my message resonates with other lawyers in particular, because behind every lawyer, I think there is a trapped idealist. People go to law school. Most people go to law school. I don't know about most. A lot of people go to law school because they're idealistic and they want to have a big impact on the world. They don't get to do that the moment they leave law school. They have student debt. They have to work at whatever job or firm or company that they get hired to work at. So the nonprofit works as a volunteer basis, and we open our doors to other lawyers to come volunteer with us, because we want to give lawyers the opportunity to make a difference in their spare time. I mean, this is what I'm doing in my spare time, and I feel like it gives me a lot of purpose. So this is a very interesting. Just Atonement, I would say, I'm rambling here. Sorry. This is the last thing I'll say. Just Atonement, the model is very innovative in the sense that we're a decentralized network, right? So lawyers from all over the world can join, align with us on certain projects, on certain subjects, and then we kind of, there's a common vision and a common organization and a common purpose. But otherwise, we're intended to be like a decentralized network. Mm-hmm. And I love that vision of human rights in the future because I think it's empowering and it doesn't require us to, doesn't have a lot of overhead. And I think it'll help spread the message faster to tell, to make our doors open to people.
Got it.
That was a lot. Sorry.
That's great. That's exactly what I was wanting. Again, you mentioned something that caught my ear, if you don't mind me asking. This is a little bit of a rabbit hole as well, but I think it's an important one given both of our naive sides, both of our having to be fair, we need to have a vision out ahead of us to be strong enough to draw us through these times.
Sure.
That's the way I'm seeing it. You mentioned about the carbon sequestration, or to be able to extract carbon from the air. And, everything that I've been looking at for the past 4 years of pretty intensively researching at the layperson level in order to write my book and have the website and be of service to people in the coaching work that I do and so on. It's a common question. So what about, the IPCC mentions all kinds of, this whole notion of being able to have negative emissions. In other words, what we can suck out of the air.
Right.
And I'm unaware of anything. There are some ideas out there. There's some fledgling technologies, but I'm aware of nothing at scale in the extraction side of the house. And then, excuse me, also is the techno-utopians who have some idea of being able to do geoengineering and have some huge impact on the atmosphere itself, or reflectivity, or albedo, and on it goes.
Right.
I'm unaware of in either camp anything that is either safe that we could actually do and not mess things up even further than we have them, or something that we could actually do at scale that wouldn't take more energy than we're now using to make it happen. Yeah. Can you say more about that? Because I noticed you mentioned it, and I don't know how to deal with that.
No, I think that you've hit the nail right on the head with that point, and I don't know of anything like that either.
Okay.
I describe those two camps actually very well, which is the IPCC and every study that I've read that talks about what do we do mentions sequestration, right? Like you said, I think it's become a reality. I think when you talk about the climate science, there is kind of a growing consensus that for us to stabilize, let's again picture our ideal. Let's at least try and stabilize things the way they are. For us to stabilize, we have to remove carbon. It's that simple. I mean, that's quote unquote simple, right? So, but then when you talk about, well, how do you do that? You're absolutely right. I haven't read anything that talks about current technology that exists. There are to sequester at scale. Mm-hmm. I have read these, a lot of what you call the techno-utopians who want to geoengineer, and I've read a lot of commentary, and I tend to agree with that commentary. It's a terrible idea, right? Because for all sorts of unintended things that could happen, and it's the kind of similar thinking, we'll just dig our way out of this hole, right? And it's no, we need a new way of thinking. And I think, I think that's the reality. I mean, trees, right? Massive reforestation helps, right? I don't think it'll be enough, but I think massive at continental scale reforestation is something that I've read that is a good first start. And I think maybe that combined with a type of Apollo project type of mentality to sequestering whatever is left might be the way to stabilize it. But that to me, if I could wave a magic wand, I would say massive reforestation, some type of Apollo like project to sequester the rest, but not dependent on it, because we just don't know if we'll invent it or not.
Mhm.
And you hope that type of economic mobilization, because that's what that would be, is an economic social mobilization, would also do the hard work to shift our economies to not be so extractive as well.
Yeah.
So
Well, if you don't mind, I would like to go a little further down that track, because of your interfacing with so many corporate entities. And I come from a background of quite a bit of corporate training back in the day, not nearly at your scale, I'm sure, but what I do recall, and it's obvious to me as I just look out in the world and just scan it, we're as embedded as ever in the infinite growth on a finite planet model.
Right.
And this is the closest. The one encouraging thing I can offer in this conversation is that more people appear to be aware of that lie.
Yeah.
And its toxicity, its lethal toxicity than ever before. There's still this big gap.
Yes.
Again, I'm kind of revealing a little bit about this upcoming book, and in which I'm asserting that we are all addicted. There was a book probably 30 years ago, maybe more, from a woman named Ann Wilson Schaaf, who talked an awful lot back in the day about addiction and codependence and so on, kind of a psychology text writer. And one of her books that really riveted me back then, and is just a perfect fit for certain parts of this book that I'm putting together, is called When Society is Addict. And so there are two sides of that addiction. One is the side of that, remember that superhuman group, the corporatist group, who are fully engaged, all the wheels in motion that way. And I'd say that all the rest of us who are, really cogs in the wheel, we're not making enough money to be able to invest and be true capitalists. We're just cogs in the wheel. Sure. But we're addicted to what little gets onto us of that luxurious stuff called fossil fuels.
Sure.
I mean, kings, there are people at the low end of the economic spectrum in the States that live better than kings did just 100 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
So we got a lot going to keep this whole thing going.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinarily addictive is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. You want to, yeah.
So the bridge that I'm asking you to explore with me is, it's all fine and dandy to have some public conversations about, there's usually not much resistance that's put up about let's transition our full-blown economy to renewables. Then everything's going to be okay. There'll be no loss in productivity. We'll keep a growth model in place. Everything's going to be great, only it'll have a green color to it.
Right. Yeah, sure.
So I'm being a little bit snarky, and I apologize, but I'm wondering how real, when you get a pulse of the corporations that you work with, the executives that you work with, how real is it to approach what appears to me to be at the center of this, anytime we use the word mitigation, is we need to slow down, and in massive swaths of our business as usual paradigm, we need to stop. And that means corporations no longer make money. or they're making a whole lot less.
Right.
And chances are they're not growing anymore. At
Sure.
best, if they're really lucky, they find a stable state.
Yeah.
But even that implies them breaking their word, which is the corporate charter, which is we are to provide profits for our shareholders. So I'm sorry for a long question. I'm wondering if that sparks anything.
It's a fantastic question. I think that's like the question, honestly, which is what does the world look like, assuming we've stabilized and we've survived and we're in the 22nd century. The way I always think about it is like, I try and pretend I'm writing from the 22nd century, right? And we've solved it. It's all solved. So what did we do? How did we solve it, right?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is a fantastic question, because let me break it down, because one thing you asked was like, when I work with my corporate clients, what's the mentality? And I would say most of the mentality is we'll be able to solve this without changing anything fundamental about our lives. I think that's the general consensus. And like you said, like, the way we'll solve it is it'll all be green capitalism, basically. It'll be the same companies, except they're running on solar and the plastic gets recycled somehow, right? And I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I will tell you philosophically, I think, because there were a lot of things you raised in there, and I want to break them apart. But I would tell you, philosophically speaking, I think consumerism is a very destructive, psychologically, spiritually, to us, to have this mentality of more all the time, more iPhones, more whatever it is. I think that's horribly destructive to us as sentients, sentient beings, not being able to just feel good about what we have and have it be enough. I come from this question from the other approach, which is like, what does the science say we have to do? And the science, from my perspective, is unequivocal that we'll need a radical transformation in some sense, because to get that carbon out, to sequester it, like I said, will either require massive, not green companies, but greening, rewilding, and that's going to look like that. Our current economic systems are set up to extract, manufacture, sell. So this is going to require the opposite, which is to restore. So if we're creating companies that are restorative and that are actually greening, that's a totally different economic paradigm, right? If the government is harnessing the power of society to create an Apollo-like project to sequester carbon, that's a totally different economic paradigm, right? So that's how I answer the question. I think we have to mobilize, and I think we have to solve those problems. And the way we do that is going to look very different than our current economic system, right? Which is laissez-faire, tens of thousands of immortal companies producing profits to their stockholders with very little regulatory oversight. That won't exist in a world where we've solved the problem for a variety of reasons, right? Now, I think, whether or not it like ends up looking, where we're at a place where it's kind of consumerism light or consumerism green, I don't know. I mean, that may end up, maybe it'll vary by country or I don't know. But I guess I would say when I approach the problem from the kind of the road that I just took, we end up at a completely different economic paradigm by necessity, and I think that it hopefully will be in a paradigm that is more decent, frankly, more caring for each other a little more. We're providing the basics a little more, and there's a better harmony with the environment, which is what we do not have at all, right? So that's how I would approach it, and I don't know if that gets the same point or ends up being somewhere else.
Well, I appreciate it. I also appreciate it's kind of unfair for me to give you that scale of question, and I'm certainly not expecting you to now answer it for us all, because this is a scale that nobody's ever had to deal with before. So I just appreciate you being real about it.
Yeah, no, and I guess the thing I would say is, I mean, I think the fundamental question you have is like the mindset that got us here is destructive. If I could summarize the mindset, and it's addicting and destructive, and the mindset will have to change, or the economy will change with that mindset, I guess. And I think that's probably right. I guess I would say, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess here's another way to put it. Is there a world where green capitalism wins and like it's the 23rd century and that's what we have? It's like iPhones, solar powered iPhones, and everything's great. I mean, it's not, you can imagine anything. I don't view that as a realistic answer in light of the massive transformations we'll have to make. So I guess I kind of look at it more practically. And, but I will say that the corporate clients that I talk to, and I have, and just my colleagues or whatever, I think most people, corporate or not corporate, I think they think that's the answer. I think they think, oh, this will all be fixed and it'll all be great, except everything will be solar powered. And I think that's just not an answer, right? Because it's not what the science is saying. So I think that goes to the psychological resistance of not understanding maybe the science, and not really getting to the point where we see the scale of the problem and how much we'll have to change to really make the future livable, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I can tell already that it's been too long since we've talked, because I want to keep going and going. And I'm hoping that we can set up another chance soon to go at this some more. I wanted to give you a chance, if you're needing or wanting to. How I was reminded to reconnect with you was that I got an email from you about a project that you're formulating, and I'm wondering if you would like to say anything about that.
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. So, and this is very in line with the stuff that we've been talking about, which is, what we came up with, what we've been thinking about at Just Atonement is, how do we tame the dragons, right? How do we actually tame the dragons? And so what we're coming up with is a campaign. We are hoping to launch in February of next year, 2019, where we looked historically at how did we get here. And one of the things we noticed is that a lot of common law powers that states have to control corporate conduct or to regulate corporate conduct has just been lying idle. And what we thought, well, why don't we actually approach the states? Now again, to use my silly analogy, like if I'm, the sheep herder and my sheep are being killed, like it would be suicide for me to go after the dragon myself, right? The dragon will eat me. But what if I can go to the Lord, in the castle, and he can assemble, or she can assemble the troops and do whatever it needs to do, and the Lord can go take on the dragon, right? And that's how I view the states attorney generals in particular. They are the mechanism that we have control and police society to defend the common person. And so what we did is we looked at state law, and we discovered, there was this movement in the late 90s. You may or may not recall that in California, there was a movement to revoke corporate charters of certain companies, particularly Unical. So there was a movement to revoke Unical's corporate charter for engaging in all sorts of corporate wrongdoing. It didn't go anywhere, unfortunately, or didn't get very far, and I think the movement kind of died. But what we thought, we looked at those laws, and we looked at the way that those people got that far, and we said, well, why don't we do this again? And the approach is slightly different. We're not asking, what we want to do is ask the state's attorney generals to first, you got to look at this issue, right? You got to look at it like now, not yesterday, not tomorrow, but now. And, understand that the urgency of the current moment, and understand that it's just a handful of companies that are really causing a lot of the problems. And we're asking them to defend us, the people, from kind of runaway consequences of climate change, and to protect our rights. So we're asking them to, and we've identified several rights: the right to life, the right to property, the right to a stable, healthy environment, the right to a stable political environment. I mean, I think is a really important right that we take for granted. But we could find ourselves in 20, 30 years with a lot of social chaos. And we have to kind of manage that today. So we're asking them to actually explore and to exercise their inherent ability that's given to them by the common law and also by the state legislatures and various statutes to examine these corporations, right? Examine them, and to approach these corporations and essentially say, look, we're going to have to change. This change is inevitable. We can either do it the right way, control it, do it today, or we wait for the tidal wave. And, ask these companies, like I said earlier in my magic wand, to become the allies that we need. We need to tame these dragons. And these companies, have a lot of power, resources, and money. So they're kind of the perfect allies for the fight, right? If you think about it, they're kind of the perfect entities that exist to actually develop the tech, whatever, hopefully the technologies we can create. And I know that's a long shot, but
can you give me an example of one of your fantasy threads of this working? Like, feel free to just name or make up a company or whatever, but what industry, what kind of company, and what kind of action if this was really going well?
Yeah. So, we have a list that an independent group put together of the top 100 fossil fuel companies that have contributed 71% of global climate emissions, right? Mm-hmm. So since the 1990s, it's I'm sure you've come across this in your work and your research, but there's like a guilt placed on the common person, like we're not doing enough. Well, we're not really responsible. It's like, it's these companies that have done the vast majority of the polluting. So in our world, in my fantasy, the state's attorney generals approach those companies, and they can be domestic or foreign. I mean, they all have to register to do business in any state that they're in. That's a very clear requirement. And to approach them and say, look, there's independent studies showing that, you're responsible. You as a company are responsible, and our citizens we're not going to be able to sustain or survive in 50 years if nothing changes. You need to clean it up. And here's our authority to make you do that. You either help, or if you don't help, then we're going to take increasingly, regulatory steps as states attorney generals to prevent you from committing further harm. And, the precedent for this, Dean, is tobacco, right? So this is exactly what happened with tobacco. Mm-hmm. Is there was a growing consensus among states attorney generals that the tobacco companies were engaged in wrongdoing, right? And it came out that it was all intentional, right? So, and this is something that other states attorney general, for example, in New York, currently Attorney General Barbara Underwood is exploring the intentionality of this against Chevron, I think right now, or Exxon, one of them, and that's an ongoing litigation. We're kind of putting intentionality besides the point. I mean, first of all, I mean, these are very smart people working at these companies. These companies are not idiots, right? I'm sure they understand the chemistry of what happens when you emit carbon or emit, when you burn fossil fuels, right? But I guess what I would say is, in the fantasy that we have, we're asking the states do just like what they did with tobacco. So now it's the time to do it with carbon, right? And to approach those same companies and to tell them the harms are just too great. And in an ideal world, you are going to use your infrastructure to clean up what you've done. And if you refuse to do that, then we have no choice but to further regulate and police your conduct. I mean, it's that simple.
I appreciate. Thank you for laying that out. And now, if I may, I don't want to be devil's advocate. But
you should be.
all I've been hearing so far is the very predictable, potent defense that these corporations are putting up. Down the Bay Area, what is it, San Francisco and Berkeley, or I'm sorry, I've forgotten which cities are actually, on the front lines trying to make the litigation side of what you've been talking about happen. And I don't get a good feeling about it. This is where the naive part of me goes and hides in the closet, because I don't get a good feeling about this. So what will be different than what's being done now?
Yeah.
And what would be the incentive for a corporation, let's say Exxon or Chevron or whatever,
Hmm.
to get next to a plan with you and say, okay, we'll help out somehow?
Yeah. Well, I think those are great questions. So you always have such great questions. So I think remember, like, we're not rushing to court directly to sue these companies.
Yeah, yeah, I
We're
get that.
rushing to the attorney generals, right? And what we're hoping to do, and this will be a journey, but we are hoping to effectively convince. Our hope is that if we can convince 5 or 10 of these guys, that this is the right approach, and to start that dialogue with them. And there's procedures to do that. Each state has a procedure that you can do this. So this is not like we're putting a letter in the mail and hoping someone reads it. I mean, there's formal procedures that you do to contact the attorney general, and they have to review it. If they don't agree with you, you can appeal that decision to a court, right? So this is a very formal kind of regulatory process, again, based on the precedent from the 90s that we reviewed from California about Unical. And the hope, basically, the way we think it's different is to build a dialogue and movement with the state attorney generals, because they're the real only ones with the power to approach these companies and say you have to stop, because they did it before. They did it with tobacco, which people would say the same thing. These companies are huge. They deny, they have all the money in the world and all the lawyers in the world to say no, and yet somehow something shifted, right? There was something that shifted in the zeitgeist, and it became very clear that these companies had to be regulated for the good of everybody, right? Yeah. So I think we're hoping to kind of it's a mix of legal, cultural, and political action,
Right.
social action, I should say. And we're hoping to start that dialogue and reaching out to people like you and others who for feedback, first of all, which I think is very important, because this will only work if enough people believe in it, right? And so getting feedback from people like you and others is really, really important and valuable, because we need to be able to inspire others to say, let's try it. What's the harm? And if it doesn't work, it just doesn't work. It's like all these other attempts, but at least we tried. I think the tobacco model, it gets people thinking, yeah, this did happen already with another powerful industry. Why can't it happen with this?
Right.
And I know that there are differences. Believe me, I know there's differences.
Yeah.
But I think that's the precedent that we're trying to get people inspired about.
Yeah. Well, Inder Comar, it's just always great to talk with you, and it's particularly great this time because it feels like you've really upped the ante, and you're kind of pushing on the boundaries of how to make a difference in what looks to be an impenetrable corporate wall.
Sure.
And so I just want to acknowledge you and your team, the interns, everybody who's involved in whatever way they are, for the courage that it takes to do that. And it's no small deal. In my side of the work, I'm putting together resources and processes and support materials and coaching to support people who are brave enough to stand in whatever their truth is. And I see that to a great extent, that's what you're doing. So I just want to acknowledge that and thank you all for doing that.
No, I appreciate that, Dean. And, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to connect with you again and to talk about this. I mean, every time we talk, I feel we always have a lot of similar, we're coming from different places, but somehow the wavelength is very aligned in terms of both the urgency of what we're up against and, hopefully the changes that we'll need to hopefully get through it, So I think we're all just hoping to get through it and also help others, I think, adjust. I think that's the point too, is, there's just going to be a lot of reality hitting people in the face, very soon. It's already hitting people,
Yes, it is.
People who had to flee Puerto Rico, the people whose homes were burned in California. I mean, this is not something that's going to happen in the future. This is already happening. So, I think it's just, it's always great to connect and kind of just, just assess, and your feedback is always invaluable.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah,
How can people find out more about you, your practice, and especially the nonprofit?
Yeah.
And also, would you say how people can locate your writings? For instance, I find you, I believe it's on Apple News.
Yeah,
how do people find you that way?
Yeah, so on Apple News, you can just look for my name in the search, which is Inder Comar, INDERCOMAR, and it should just pop up. And then, in terms of our nonprofit, it's justatonement.org, JUST Atonement, ATONEMENT.org. And we also have an Instagram that we're kind of getting up and going, but we're excited about, just because we have some good graphics. And once we've gotten some good feedback from others about what we're calling the climate letter, this is the campaign, the climate letter. Mm-hmm. And we will start, putting that more on social media about getting involved with supporting the climate letter. And then our for-profit firm is Comar LLP, and that's COMAR law.com, and people can read about our corporate work there.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, once again, I just thank you so much for your time and for your work. And I'm going to bug you not too long from now.
Please do.
If it's okay with you, maybe as soon as end of January.
Yeah, that'd be great.
I think that there's a tremendous value in talking with you, because you bring a particular part of our world, the part that interfaces with kind of, for many of the folks in this conversation, the bad guys, the corporate side, the offenders, and so on. Sure. And there's so little input from folks who know about that arena.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that you bring a balance, and you are actually bringing the possibility of a way to bridge between people.
Yeah.
God knows we need some bridges going on in this polarized world.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dean. And I think you just have to try. I can't guarantee that any result, but.
Oh, Inder. No, man, I'm counting on you. You got to get it.
But I think you have to try. And I guess the point too is, I think for me, if we can actually make some of these dragons our allies, I mean, then the world starts to look, this problem becomes more solvable, right? So, and that may not end up be possible, but I think that if we can at least start that dialogue, just like with tobacco, maybe that's something between the states and these companies to fight against. And then that gives people like you and me, or non-lawyers or whatever, more power as well, because you as a citizen have direct access to your state attorney general. You can vote in the election for a state attorney general who says, I'm going to do this, right? So that gives citizens direct power over this problem too. And that's something that maybe we should emphasize when we're talking about the climate letter, is that, this is a way to connect directly with the one official in your state who can actually possibly do something about this. So.
Well, I know we've shoved this into the last 30 seconds of this interview, but I would recommend that highly, because I don't know a dang thing about how state government works and who to be talking to and who's influential and in what way. So what you've just said is something that I would want to know, and I certainly will. I'm up in here in Oregon. I'll make sure that I know how it works up here and find out who is doing something in the ballpark of what you're doing.
Yeah. Excellent.
What you're doing in California. So all the best to you.
Great. All the best to you, Dean. Yeah, great to connect.
Immense challenges you've taken on.
Yeah, I look forward to our next one. Okay, take care.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.